What you're about to hear is not some tall tale whispered around a campfire or legend passed down through generations of frontier storytellers. This is the documented, verified, medically examined account of a man who took an axe blade directly to his skull and lived to tell about it. Now, I know what you're thinking. You've heard stories before. You've seen movies where cowboys shake off bullet wounds like mosquito bites, where men walk away from bar fights that should have killed them 3 times over. But this is different. This is the story of Phineas Gage, a railroad foreman working in the mountains of Vermont in 1848, who suffered an injury so catastrophic, so impossibly brutal, that doctors of his time couldn't believe he survived the first 5 minutes, let alone walked and talked and lived for another 12 years. And here's the thing that makes this story even more incredible. The weapon that nearly killed him wasn't wielded by an enemy. It wasn't some vengeful outlaw or a rival trying to settle a score. No, the instrument of destruction was a tamping iron, a 13-pound steel rod measuring 3 feet 7 inches long and over an inch in diameter, and it was propelled through his head by his own hand, during what should have been just another day's work on the railroad. Before we dive into the moment that changed everything, before we get to the blood and the bone and the impossible survival, you need to understand who Phineas Gage was before September 13, 1848. You need to know what was lost and what remained, because this story isn't just about a man surviving a horrific accident. It's about what happens when you survive something you shouldn't, when your body keeps going, but the person you were gets left behind somewhere in the trauma. Phineas was 25 years old, born and raised in New Hampshire, a young man who had built a reputation as one of the most capable and efficient foremen working for the Rutland and Burlington Railroad. Now, if you don't know much about railroad construction in the mid-19th century, let me paint you a picture. This wasn't operating machinery from a comfortable seat. This wasn't pushing buttons or pulling levers. This was back-breaking, dangerous work that required strength, precision, and nerves of absolute steel. Teams of men would blast through mountains of solid rock using black powder explosives, clearing paths for iron reels that would eventually connect the scattered towns and cities of a rapidly expanding nation. Phineas's specific job was to set these explosive charges, and he was considered one of the best in the business. His employers described him as the most efficient and capable foreman in their service, a man of iron will and temperate habits, someone who commanded respect from his workers through competence rather than intimidation. The work followed a specific, dangerous rhythm. First, his crew would drill a hole deep into the rock face, sometimes several feet down into solid granite. Then Phineas would carefully pour the blasting powder into that hole, using his tamping iron to pack it down, creating the compression necessary for a proper explosion. After the powder came a fuse, and then sand or clay, which also had to be tamped down to direct the explosive force into the rock rather than back out toward the workers. It was delicate work, the kind where a moment's distraction or a single mistake could cost you your life or the lives of the men working beside you. The tamping iron itself was a custom-made tool, forged specifically for this purpose. Imagine a metal rod tapered to a sharp point on one end, the other end flat and wide enough to strike with a hammer or mallet. It weighed 13¼ pounds, heavy enough that you felt it in your arms after a full day of work, but balanced in a way that made it an extension of your body when you knew how to use it properly. Phineas had used this exact tamping iron hundreds of times, maybe thousands. It was as familiar as his own hands, a tool he could wield with his eyes closed, which is almost poetic when you consider what was about to happen. September 13th, 1848, started like any other workday. The site was near Cavendish, Vermont. where the railroad was being cut through a particularly stubborn section of rocky terrain. The morning had been productive. Holes had been drilled, charges had been set and detonated, and the crew was making good progress. It was late afternoon when they prepared for another blast. Phineas supervised the drilling of the hole, watched as the black powder was poured, then stepped in to do what he'd done countless times before. He positioned the tamping iron into the hole and began packing down the powder with firm, measured strikes. This is where accounts vary slightly on the exact sequence of events, but the most widely accepted version suggests that Phineas was momentarily distracted, perhaps by a question from one of his crew members, perhaps by something he saw over his shoulder. For just a second, his attention wavered. He turned his head, began to respond, and in that moment of distraction, his hands continued the familiar motion. The tamping iron came down, metal striking rock. But he hadn't yet added the sand that was supposed to sit on top of the powder. The iron struck bare blasting powder, and in an instant, everything changed. The powder ignited. The confined space of the drilled hole turned that explosion into a directed force, and the tamping iron became a missile. It shot upward with the force of a cannonball, entering Phineas Gage's skull just below his left cheekbone. Now, I want you to really picture this for a moment, because the trajectory of this iron rod through Phineas's head is so specific, so bizarrely precise, that it seems almost designed by some cruel intelligence. The tapered point entered beneath his left cheek, passed behind his left eye, and then proceeded to travel upward through the front portion of his brain, specifically through what we now know as the left frontal lobe. It continued its path through the top of his skull, exiting through the front of his head near the midline, somewhere around where his hairline met his forehead. The iron didn't just pierce his head. It didn't just crack his skull. It obliterated bone, pulverized brain tissue, and emerged from the top of his head, still traveling with enough force that it landed approximately 80 feet away, covered in blood and brain matter. Witnesses later described it as landing with a heavy thud behind where Phineas had been standing, embedding itself in the ground. The men working nearby were paralyzed with horror. Some thought Phineas had been completely decapitated. Others assumed they were about to watch a man die in the most gruesome fashion imaginable. But here's where this story takes its first impossible turn. Phineas Gage did not die. He didn't even lose consciousness, at least not right away. According to multiple witness accounts, including statements from the men who were there and later testimony from the doctors who treated him, Phineas was thrown backward by the force of the explosion and impact of the rod, landing hard on the ground. He convulsed for a few moments, and then, impossibly, he sat up. He sat up. Let me say that again, because I need you to understand how medically improbable this was even before we get to everything else. A man just had a 13-pound iron rod fired through his brain, through the front portion of his skull, creating an exit wound several inches in diameter, and he sat up. Within minutes, possibly within a minute or two, Phineas was speaking. Not screaming incoherently, not babbling in shock, but actually communicating. He told his men that he wanted to be taken to his boarding house. He asked about his tamping iron. According to some accounts, he even commented on the accident itself with disturbing clarity, saying something to the effect that he'd made a mistake, that he should have been more careful. His crew, still in a state of shock themselves, helped him into an ox cart for the 3/4-mile journey back to town. Imagine being one of those workers, looking at your foreman, a man you've known and respected, sitting upright in that cart with a hole through his head, blood pouring down his face, brain matter visible in the wound, and he's talking to you.
He's conscious, he's giving instructions. The human mind cannot process something like that. It violates everything we instinctively know about how fragile we are, about what kinds of injuries are survivable and which absolutely are not.
When they reached the boarding house where Phineas was staying, he climbed down from the cart under his own power. Think about that. He walked. A contemporary account states that he sat down on the porch, waiting for medical attention, and when the first doctor arrived about 30 minutes after the accident, Phineas greeted him with a piece of dark, grim humor that would become one of the most famous quotes in medical history. Dr. Edward Williams approached, probably expecting to find a corpse or a man barely clinging to life, and Phineas looked up at him and said in a conversational tone, "Here comes business enough for you. Business enough for you." The man had a cavity in his skull you could fit your fist into, and he was making jokes about it. Dr. Williams later wrote that he initially didn't believe the story the workers were telling him. He thought perhaps they'd exaggerated, that maybe Phineas had been struck by the rod but not actually pierced through the head. Then he examined the wound. Williams documented what he saw with clinical precision, and his description is almost harder to read than the accident itself because of how detached and medical it is when describing something so horrific. The entry wound below the left cheekbone was relatively small, but the exit wound at the top of the skull was massive, an irregular opening where bone had been completely blown away. Williams could see directly into Phineas's brain. He could see brain tissue pulsing with Phineas's heartbeat. He could see blood and cerebrospinal fluid mixing together, running down the man's face, while Phineas sat there, still conscious, still talking, still impossible. Dr. Williams was soon joined by another local physician, Dr. John Harlow, who would become the primary documenter of Phineas Gage's case, and whose meticulous notes are the reason we know as much as we do about what happened next. Dr. Harlow examined Phineas and came to the same shocked conclusion as his colleague. The injuries were real, they were as severe as described, and somehow, impossibly, the patient was stable enough to treat. Now, understand something about medicine in 1848. This was before the germ theory of disease was widely accepted. This was before antiseptic surgical techniques. This was before antibiotics, before CT scans, before any of the tools and knowledge that would make treating a head injury like this even remotely feasible by modern standards. What doctors did have were basic surgical instruments, some rudimentary understanding of anatomy, and a whole lot of experience watching people die from injuries far less severe than what Phineas had sustained. The prevailing medical opinion was that brain injuries of any real severity were essentially untreatable and almost always fatal. Phineas Gage should have been dead before he reached the boarding house, and if not then, certainly within hours, as infection, swelling, or hemorrhaging finished what the tamping iron had started. But Phineas wasn't following the medical textbook, which made sense given that there was no entry in any medical textbook for a 13-pound iron rod being explosively driven through someone's frontal lobe. Dr. Harlow's first priority was to clean and stabilize the wounds, which meant removing shattered fragments of bone, trying to control the bleeding, and attempting to close the massive opening in Phineas's skull as much as possible. He described finding numerous bone fragments, some driven into the brain tissue itself, others scattered throughout the wound cavity. He removed what he could, irrigated the wounds with water, and then applied a simple dressing. There wasn't much else he could do. The treatment plan for the next days and weeks was essentially to keep the wounds clean, watch for infection, and hope that Phineas's body could somehow heal itself from trauma that had destroyed a significant portion of his brain. For the first few days, it looked like that hope might actually be justified. Phineas remained conscious and relatively comfortable. He experienced pain, certainly, but it was manageable. He could speak clearly, answer questions, and seemed to recognize the people around him. Dr. Harlow wrote that Phineas was rational and cooperative, which is medical speak for not screaming in agony or lost in delirium. On the second day after the accident, Phineas even asked about his tamping iron, wanting to know where it was and if it had been damaged in the explosion.
This detail might seem trivial, but it demonstrates that Phineas's memory was intact, that he remembered the accident and understood what had happened to him. His cognitive functions, at least in those first couple of days, seemed remarkably preserved considering the circumstances. But then, on the fourth day, everything changed. Phineas developed a fever and began slipping in and out of consciousness. The infection that every doctor had been dreading had arrived, and it arrived with a vengeance. Phineas's condition deteriorated rapidly over the next week. His fever spiked, the wound became inflamed, and began producing copious amounts of foul-smelling pus, which Dr. Harlow had to drain repeatedly. Fungal growth appeared in the wound cavity, a particularly gruesome complication that required aggressive treatment. Phineas became delirious, thrashing in his bed, no longer recognizing his caretakers, slipping deeper into what everyone assumed would be a terminal decline. Dr. Harlow later wrote that he held out almost no hope for recovery at this stage. He'd seen many infections follow traumatic injuries, and this one was particularly severe. The expectation was that Phineas would either die from the infection itself or develop an abscess in his remaining brain tissue that would kill him within days. The doctor's notes from this period make for grim reading. He documented pulse rates, fever temperatures, wound drainage, and the patient's mental state with the detached precision of someone who was essentially writing a post-mortem report in advance. And then, somehow, Phineas turned a corner. The fever broke, the delirium lifted. By the end of September, less than 3 weeks after a metal rod had been blown through his brain, Phineas Gage was sitting up in bed, eating solid food, and engaging in coherent conversation. By mid-October, he was walking around. By November, he was talking about going back to work. Dr. Harlow could barely believe what he was witnessing.
The medical literature of the time had absolutely nothing to prepare him for recovery like this. He began presenting Phineas's case to other doctors, writing detailed accounts of the injury and the treatment, knowing that this was something extraordinary, something that would need to be documented for the medical community. But here's where the story gets complicated. Because while Phineas's body had recovered in a way that defied all medical expectations, something else had changed. Something fundamental about who Phineas Gage was as a person had been altered by that rod passing through his frontal lobe. And it would take months for everyone around him to fully realize just how profound those changes were. Remember how I described Phineas before the accident? Efficient, capable, respected, a man of temperate habits and iron will. His employers had considered him their best foreman. His workers followed his leadership. He was, by all accounts, a model of responsibility and competence. That Phineas Gage didn't come back. In his place was someone who looked the same, who could walk and talk and perform basic functions, but whose personality had been fundamentally altered. Dr. Harlow, who continued to follow Phineas's case for years after the initial recovery, documented these changes with the same meticulous attention he'd given to the physical wounds. What he described was unsettling. The new Phineas was fitful, irreverent, indulging at times in the grossest profanity, which was not previously his custom. He became impatient of restraint or advice when it conflicted with his desires. His friends and acquaintances said he was no longer Gage. The balance between his intellectual faculties and his animal propensities had been destroyed. Now, let's unpack what that actually meant in practical terms, because medical jargon from the 1840s doesn't quite capture the reality of what people were witnessing. Phineas had lost impulse control. Before the accident, if he wanted something but knew it was inappropriate or unwise, he could restrain himself. After the accident,
That filter was gone. If he wanted to say something crude or offensive, he said it, regardless of the social situation. If he had a desire or impulse, he acted on it without considering consequences. He became unreliable. Before the accident, if Phineas said he would do something, you could count on it happening. After the accident, he would make plans and then abandon them on a whim. He would start projects with enthusiasm and lose interest within hours or days. His employers tried to bring him back to work on the railroad, hoping that returning to familiar tasks would help stabilize him, but they quickly realized it wasn't possible. The Phineas they had known, the one who could manage men and coordinate complex, dangerous work, was gone. This new Phineas couldn't focus long enough to complete assignments, couldn't maintain the discipline necessary to work safely with explosives, couldn't command the respect of workers who now saw him as erratic and unreliable. He lost his job. Then he lost several more jobs in succession because employers would hire him based on his previous reputation, discovered that the man they'd hired no longer existed, and let him go. His social relationships deteriorated. Friends distanced themselves. His family struggled to adapt to this new person who wore Phineas's face but acted like a stranger.
Here's what makes this particularly tragic from a modern perspective. Phineas wasn't trying to be difficult. He wasn't choosing to act inappropriately or failing to live up to his responsibilities because of laziness or malice. The physical damage to his frontal lobe had destroyed the parts of his brain responsible for executive function, for planning, for impulse control, for the aspects of personality that make us capable of functioning in civilized society. He was, in a very real sense, no longer in full control of his own behavior. And nobody in 1848 understood that, because neuroscience as we know it didn't exist yet. The very idea that different parts of the brain were responsible for different functions was still controversial. Many doctors believed the brain operated as a unified whole, that you couldn't damage one area without affecting everything. Phineas Gage's case would eventually become one of the foundational pieces of evidence that proved that theory wrong, that demonstrated conclusively that specific brain regions controlled specific functions, but that understanding came later. Too late to help Phineas himself. In the immediate aftermath, people just knew that the accident had somehow changed him, had left him diminished, had taken something essential away, even as it miraculously spared his life. So, what happened to Phineas after he lost his railroad job? This is where his story becomes harder to track because a man with no stable employment and an altered personality doesn't leave the kind of documentary trail that a respected foreman does. We know he worked various odd jobs. We know he spent some time traveling with his tamping iron as part of what amounted to a medical curiosity show, standing on stages and in museum exhibitions, allowing people to gawk at his scars while he held the rod that had passed through his head. Imagine that for a moment. Imagine being reduced to putting yourself on display like a circus act, having your greatest trauma turned into entertainment, standing there while strangers whisper and point and try to imagine what it must have been like. For a man who had once been respected, who had been capable and competent and in control of his destiny, this must have been a special kind of hell. But he needed money, and this was apparently one of the few ways he could earn it given his limitations. There's a photograph of Phineas from this period, one of the few pieces of visual evidence we have of him. It's a daguerreotype, the photographic technology of the time, and it shows a young man, still in his 20s, holding his tamping iron. The photo is formal, as all photographs were in that era, with Phineas seated and staring into the camera with the serious expression that was standard when exposure times required you to hold still for extended periods. But if you look closely at that photograph, knowing what you know now, you can see the slight asymmetry in his face, the suggestion of the catastrophic injury he'd survived. He's holding that tamping iron almost casually, like it's just a walking stick or a prop.
not the instrument of his destruction. That photograph became famous in medical circles, was reproduced in textbooks and journals, turned Phineas into an icon of neuroscience, even as the man himself struggled to survive. In 1852, 4 years after the accident, Phineas left the United States and traveled to Chile, where he found work driving a stagecoach in and around Valparaiso. This might seem like an odd career choice, but it actually makes sense when you think about it. Driving a stagecoach was demanding work that required attention and skill, but it was also relatively solitary and structured. The route was predetermined, the expectations were clear, and there wasn't the same level of complex social interaction that had made other jobs impossible for him. By some accounts, Phineas actually thrived in this role. The physical demands of the work, the routine, the lack of need for complex decision-making, all of these factors played to his remaining strengths while minimizing his weaknesses. He spent several years in Chile, and during that time, some people who knew him reported that he seemed to stabilize somewhat, that the worst of his erratic behavior moderated. Modern neurologists who have studied Phineas's case speculate that this improvement might have been the result of neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself to some degree after injury. It's possible that other parts of Phineas's brain gradually took over some of the functions that his destroyed frontal lobe could no longer perform. It's also possible that he simply learned to adapt, developing coping strategies that helped him manage his impulses better. Or maybe the structured nature of his life in Chile, the daily routine of the stagecoach work, provided external discipline that compensated for his lack of internal control. We'll never know for certain, but what is clear is that by the time Phineas returned to the United States in 1859, he was in declining health.
The cause of that decline is another medical mystery wrapped inside this already extraordinary case. Some historians believe he began experiencing seizures, a common complication of traumatic brain injuries. Others point to the possibility of chronic infections related to his original wounds, complications that might have been slowly worsening over the years. Whatever the cause, Phineas moved to San Francisco to live with his mother and sister, and his condition continued to deteriorate. On May 21, 1860, almost 12 years to the day after the accident that should have killed him instantly, Phineas Gage died following a series of severe seizures. He was 36 years old. His family buried him in San Francisco, and for a while, it seemed like that would be the end of his story. But Dr. John Harlow, the physician who had treated Phineas's initial injuries and followed his case with such dedication, hadn't forgotten about his most famous patient. In 1866, Harlow tracked down Phineas's family and made an unusual request. He wanted to exhume the body. Specifically, he wanted to examine Phineas's skull, to see how the bone had healed, to understand better what had happened inside that head during those 12 years of impossible survival. The family agreed, and Phineas's remains were exhumed. What Harlow found was extraordinary, even by the standards of an already extraordinary case. The skull showed clear evidence of healing. Bone had attempted to regrow around the massive exit wound at the top of the head, though it hadn't fully closed the opening. The entry wound beneath the cheekbone had healed more completely. You could trace the exact path the tamping iron had taken through bone that had been alive, that had been part of a functioning human being when the rod passed through it. Harlow took the skull, preserving it along with the tamping iron itself, and both artifacts eventually made their way to Harvard Medical School, where they remain to this day in the Warren Anatomical Museum. If you ever find yourself in Boston, you can go see them. You can stand in front of a glass case and look at the actual skull, see the actual damage, hold in your mind the impossible fact that the man who owned that skull lived for 12 more years after it was catastrophically damaged. But Phineas Gage's real immortality isn't in a museum case. It's in the foundations of neuroscience itself, because his case became one of the most important pieces of evidence in understanding how the brain works. Before Phineas, the idea that different brain regions controlled different functions was controversial. After Phineas, it became undeniable. His frontal lobe had been destroyed, and specific aspects of his personality had changed, while other functions remained intact. He could still speak, still move, still remember, still perceive the world around him, but he couldn't plan, couldn't control his impulses, couldn't maintain the executive function that makes us fully human. That was revolutionary. Every modern neuroscience textbook mentions Phineas Gage. Every discussion of frontal lobe function references his case. He's been the subject of countless papers, books, documentaries, and academic studies. Scientists have used modern imaging technology to create computer models of his skull, tracing the exact path of the tamping iron with precision that Dr. Harlow could never have imagined. They've debated the extent of his personality changes, with some recent scholarship suggesting that Dr. Harlow's descriptions might have been exaggerated or that Phineas's adaptation over time was more significant than originally reported. But none of that changes the fundamental facts. A man survived an injury that destroyed a significant portion of his brain, an injury that should have killed him instantly, and he lived for 12 more years. His survival, his changes, his struggle, and his eventual death, all of it contributed to our understanding of the human brain, of consciousness, of what makes us who we are. Now, before we wrap this up, I want to circle back to where we started, because there's a bigger question lurking behind this entire story. What does it mean to survive something like this? Phineas Gage didn't die, which by the strictest definition means he survived. But did he really? The man who took that tamping iron through his skull was, by all accounts, not the same man who woke up the next day. His friends said he was no longer Gage. If the essence of who you are, your personality, your impulses, your ability to function as the person you've always been, if all of that changes, have you really survived? Or has someone new taken up residence in your body? These are philosophical questions that go beyond medicine, beyond history, and they're questions that we still grapple with today when dealing with traumatic brain injuries, with dementia, with any condition that alters personality while leaving the body intact.
Modern medicine has advanced to the point where we can save people from injuries that would have been instantly fatal in Phineas's time. But we're still struggling with the question of what it means to save someone's life if who they are fundamentally changes in the process. Phineas's case forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that we are, in a very physical sense, our brains. Damage the right parts, and you don't just lose function, you lose yourself. That's terrifying and humbling in equal measure. It's also why his story has endured for more than 170 years, why it continues to be taught and studied and referenced, because it's not just about a bizarre medical anomaly. It's about the nature of survival, identity, and what makes us human. So here we are, at the end of one of the most remarkable survival stories in American history, a tale that begins with an explosion, a rod, and a man who should have died instantly, but instead lived long enough to change our understanding of the human brain forever.
Phineas Gage survived having his skull split by what was essentially an iron spear fired through his head by explosive force. He survived infections that should have killed him. He survived long enough to become a legend in neuroscience. But he couldn't survive what the injury took from him, that intangible essence of who he had been before September 13th, 1848. And maybe that's the real lesson of Phineas Gage. Sometimes the most extraordinary survival stories aren't about living through impossible circumstances. They're about what happens afterward, about what you do with the life you've been given back, even if that life is fundamentally different than the one you had before.